Welcome back to Reformed Thinking, where we aim to approach the written word with the care and the tools needed to really understand how it works.
Today, we are beginning a deep dive into the literary landscape of the Old Testament. We're going to be looking at the different genres you find in these ancient documents, working from the idea that how you read something depends entirely on what kind of thing you're reading.
And that's really the starting point, isn't it? This whole idea of genre analysis. It's sort of like being handed a compass before you set out on a long hike. It just sets the right expectations for how you approach a text.
Think about two very short texts for a second. Let's say text number one is a children's rhyme, something like The Grand Old Duke of York. We know right away what it's for.
It's for entertainment, for kids to sing. You expect a certain rhythm, maybe some hand motions, but you definitely don't expect a historically accurate account of 18th century military tactics.
Not at all. Now, contrast that with text number two, a courtroom oath. Do you solemnly swear that you will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? It's also very short, but the genre, the setting, it all sets up a completely different expectation.
Right. Its whole point is to get somebody to tell the truth.
You'd never look for amusement in that oath. And if you tried to hold the children's rhyme to a standard of historical fact, you'd just be misreading it completely. The genre gives you the rules of the game.
And that's what frames what we're doing here. We're taking a cue from scholars like Leland Ryken, who pointed out that when the Bible uses a literary method, it's basically asking us to approach it as literature.
So we're digging into the main literary genres of the Old Testament to try and gain some of that cultural familiarity. We need to read these ancient documents the way they were meant to be read.
And avoid applying the wrong set of rules. Let's take another example. Text number 3, that popular saying, "Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime."
The structure itself, that parallel contrast, it tells you its purpose right away. It's designed to teach that the wisest course of action is the one with the best long-term effect. It's a piece of wisdom literature.
Okay, and text number 4, an excerpt from the Declaration of Independence. We can pretty quickly see that its genre is an affirmation, a group of people stating certain principles they hold to be true. The setting is specific. July 4, 1776, Philadelphia.
And you can see the structure. It starts with a short summary, all men are created equal, and then it expands on 3 principles: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Its goal is just to state that affirmation.
And we also know it's part of a much larger document, a declaration, which gives it its context.
Right. And the fact that we can figure all of this out so quickly is what some have called literary competence. It's a mix of understanding the words themselves, the grammar and syntax, and also recognizing the genre.
That's the part that's sort of instinctive. It's the cultural cues that tell you a newspaper headline is written to inform, while a poem next to it is written to make you feel something.
Yeah. And that's our big challenge with the Old Testament. We didn't grow up in ancient Mesopotamia or Canaan. We're missing those immediate cultural cues because of the huge gap in time and geography.
But we do have a couple of advantages. The first is that we share common human experiences. We understand legal procedures, we get the idea of passing on wisdom, we know what historical documents are for.
And our second advantage is that we have modern literary tools. If we use them carefully, they can help us decode the structure and the rhetorical signals in these ancient writings and, in a way, bridge that gap.
So the goal for our study here is really threefold. First, we want to provide some first steps in thinking literarily about the Bible, looking at how the message is being delivered.
Second, we'll introduce some preliminary literary vocabulary to help with interpretation.
And third, by seeing the skill and artistry in these texts, we can really enhance our understanding and just our enjoyment of the Bible. You move from seeing it as a flat collection of facts to this finely crafted set of communications.
Our core belief here is that God conveyed his revelation in written literature so that people could understand it. So proper interpretation means we need to use these literary tools. They help us understand the Bible as a whole and avoid serious misreadings.
Okay, so let's begin our survey with the largest group of literature in the Old Testament, narratives.
Right. Narratives, or prose stories, make up about a third of the Old Testament. And that fact alone tells you something. The ancient audience learned best through story and example, not through, abstract doctrinal statements.
And to read them correctly, we have to get their purpose right. They are designed more to instruct than they are to simply inform. They're meant to teach later generations about how to live in a way that honors God.
It's really key to clarify here that when we talk about biblical narratives as stories, we are not in any way suggesting they aren't historical. The having happenness of the event is critical to its meaning.
That's a great point. Biblical narratives are more than history because they have this literary shape and theological purpose, but they are certainly not less than history. So a good reading has to appreciate both the historical event and the literary form used to tell us about it.
The most basic building block of all these narratives is what we call a report. It's the simplest form of story.
What did that look like?
Reports are usually brief, self-contained, and told in the third person. They're about a single past event, and they just state the facts pretty straightforwardly, without a lot of stylistic flair or character development.
So, kind of like an administrative record?
In a way, yes. You see this used for things like tribal settlements in Judges 1, or for royal building projects, like the details about Solomon's construction work in 1 Kings 7.
And military campaigns too, right? Like that short note about Pharaoh Shushak's campaign in 1 Kings 14. They're just functional records?
Exactly. Sometimes, though, a report has what's called an etiological purpose. That's just a fancy way of saying it's told to explain how a place or a custom got its name.
Like in Genesis 35, where the burial of Rebekah's nurse under an oak tree explains why the place was called the Oak of Weeping. It links a place on the map to a specific event in their history.
Precisely. And within this category of reports, there are a few specialized types that have very clear stylistic rules.
Okay.
Construction reports are one. They are super detailed about the size, materials, and decorations of important buildings. Think about the tabernacle in Exodus 36, or the Jerusalem temple in 1 Kings 6. The sheer level of detail is part of the message.
It communicates that this is a serious matter, that God is due this specific, meticulous honor.
Then you have dream reports. These are easy to spot. They're usually identified by the repetition of the verb to dream and the use of a specific Hebrew particle, wehene, which means and behold. It's like a spotlight signaling something strange is happening in the dream.
And crucially, they always need an interpretation, right? The dream itself is just the medium.
Right. You always get a separate scene where someone explains what the dream means. You see it perfectly with Joseph in Genesis 37, and then again with Pharaoh in Genesis 41.
We also run into epiphany reports. These are about an appearance of God or the angel of the Lord to someone, usually to give a message. The Hebrew verb for to appear is the main signal for this.
Abraham's life is full of these. God appears to him in Genesis 12 to promise him the land, then again in Genesis 17 to establish the covenant. And if this happens in a dream, it's a dream epiphany, like Jacob's ladder at Bethel.
So, moving up a level in complexity, we get to historical stories.
Yes. These are reports with more literary elaboration. They have a basic plot that moves from some kind of tension to a resolution. They often have a lot of dialogue and dramatic touches.
Good examples would be Saul becoming king in 1 Samuel 11. There's a clear crisis with the Ammonites, and Saul provides the dramatic solution.
Or the confrontation between Ahab and the prophet Micaiah in 1 Kings 22. It's structured almost like a short play that leads directly to Ahab's death.
And when you compile a whole bunch of these reports and stories together with a specific purpose, you get a history.
Yes, a lengthy document where an editor has structured the material to highlight certain themes or connections. The goal is to evaluate the past, to either instruct or legitimize something in the present.
This is where we see the theological perspective of the writers really clearly, like the difference between Kings and Chronicles.
Right. They cover a lot of the same historical ground, but their purposes are very different. Kings, probably written during the exile, looks back at the monarchy as a spiritual failure that led to judgment.
But Chronicles, written after the exile, is trying to give the new community a positive spiritual heritage to build on. It focuses on Judah, on David, on the temple, and it pretty much skips over the Northern Kingdom's failures.
So, with all these different types, how should we go about interpreting a simple report?
For the basic functional kind, you have to focus on the main subject and then ask how it fits into the themes of the larger section it's in. Since they just state facts, the theological points usually have to be drawn from the context.
A great example is Joshua 12. It's just a list of the kings that Yahweh defeated. The report itself is just a tally.
But when you read it in the context of the whole book of Joshua, the implied themes are huge. God's power, his faithfulness to his promises, and his worthiness of Israel's gratitude.
But in reports where God is a direct participant, like an epiphany, the themes are much more explicit. In Jacob's dream report, the message is right there on the surface. God is personally with Jacob and will be with him on his journey.
Reports can also communicate things indirectly. The reader has to look for subtle cues from the writer. So back in 1 Kings 22, the story makes the prophet Micaiah out to be a courageous hero.
And by doing that, the text is condemning King Ahab's half-hearted religion. It's holding up Micaiah's faithfulness as the standard and showing how far the king has fallen from it.
Okay, let's move from those building blocks to genres that are built around major characters. We can start with the heroic narrative.
This would be a series of episodes that focuses on the life of a central figure. It usually covers their birth, marriage, their life's work, and their death.
And the point here is to highlight the hero's virtue or exceptional bravery, right? These stories seem to come from a culture's desire to embody its core values in the life of a representative character.
That's right. The life of Moses, which runs from Exodus all the way through Deuteronomy, is the main example in the Old Testament. His story isn't just about him. It embodies the struggles of the whole nation of Israel and holds up the ideal of total loyalty to God.
The stories in Judges about figures like Deborah, Gideon, or Samson would also fit here, showing how God brings salvation through these local heroes.
And these narratives teach by example, both positive and negative. They show what loyalty looks like, but they also use flawed heroes, like Samson, to show the consequences of compromising God's standards.
Then we have a more specialized genre, the prophet story.
This is a story about a prophet's life that demonstrates their virtues, but it also has another critical function. It offers a theological critique of the world they lived in.
So it has a twofold purpose. First, to show the audience what true faith under pressure looks like.
And second, to discredit the political and religious system of the day for denying Yahweh's sovereignty.
The stories about Elijah and Elisha in 1 and 2 Kings are perfect examples. They're constantly challenging the state-sponsored apostasy of Ahab's family.
And the miracles in those stories are a big part of that critique. When Elisha purifies the poisoned stew or raises the Shunammite's son, it's a display of Yahweh's power that implicitly shows the powerlessness of Baal.
Daniel, in the first 6 chapters of his book, is another model. He shows what faithfulness looks like under the pressure of a foreign empire, and his story critiques the arrogance of emperors who think they are gods.
And what about Jonah? He's a prophet, but his story feels different.
He's the negative example, the anti-hero. The book of Jonah uses him to teach the reader about having a God-honoring attitude toward non-Israelites. It suggests that Israel was, in a way, running from its mission to be a light to the nations, just like Jonah ran to Tarshish.
So when we interpret these heroic and prophet stories, we should start with the main character. How does their life model a relationship with God and other people? And what parts of the culture is the story trying to critique?
And since the heroes represent certain values, we have to ask what those values are. Abraham models this persistent faith. Ahab, on the other hand, is a portrait of faithlessness. We ask what kind of conduct the story is trying to encourage in its audience.
And we also need to look for the big theological themes like election or apostasy or challenges to covenant leadership. For application, we have to think in terms of analogies.
What do you mean by that?
Well, for example, the stories of the patriarchs show God miraculously overcoming infertility to keep his promise alive. The analogy for a Christian today isn't a blanket promise that God will solve every case of infertility.
Right. The analogy is that this shows God's supernatural determination to carry out his plan of salvation, no matter the obstacles.
Exactly. Okay, let's turn to a genre with a happier ending. Comedy.
In literary terms, a comedy is a story with a happy ending, usually through some kind of dramatic reversal. It often aims to amuse the reader through satire, irony, or mistaken identities, and it usually ends with a wedding, a feast, or a great victory.
The Book of Esther is a classic biblical comedy. The plot is a total tragedy-turned-triumph. You have Haman's plot, Esther's hidden identity, the king's insomnia happening at just the right moment.
And that amazing reversal where the gallows built for Mordecai ends up being used for Haman.
Then there's the Joseph story in Genesis. It moves from the tragedy of his exile and imprisonment all the way to his rise as prime minister, saving his family, and that incredibly emotional reconciliation with his brothers.
So to interpret a comedy, we have to trace the plot carefully. You look for the initial crisis, the turning point, and then the climax where everything gets flipped on its head.
And character development is key. You have to notice the traits of the heroes and villains. Esther grows from being reluctant to being incredibly bold. Haman, on the other hand, goes from complete arrogance to total self-pity and defeat.
We also have to ask about God's role. Is it direct or indirect? In Esther, God is never mentioned by name.
But the author strings together a whole series of coincidences that the original audience would have seen as the clear work of God's hidden providence.
Joseph makes it explicit. He tells his brothers that God guided all the ups and downs of his life to preserve Israel. So the main theme becomes clear: God's guidance and preservation of his people, even when things look hopeless.
Let's talk now about embedded genres. These are smaller literary forms that show up inside a larger story to make a point or illustrate a truth.
Like a popular proverb. These are short, well-known sayings that comment on something happening in the story.
The phrase, "Is Saul also among the prophets?"
Hmm.
from 1 Samuel is a great example. It became a saying people used when someone started acting in a completely unexpected way.
Then you have riddles. Samson's riddle at his wedding feast is the famous one. Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet.
Riddles were often used in diplomacy as a way to test someone's wisdom or exert a bit of intellectual control over a situation.
We also find fables, where plants or animals act like people to teach moral. Jotham's fable in Judges 9 about the trees looking for a king is a political warning against the leader Abimelech.
And King Jehoash's fable in 2 Kings 14 about the thistle and the cedar is a diplomatic insult, a warning to another king not to get too big for his britches.
A parable is similar, but it uses human characters. Nathan's parable to David about the rich man and the poor man's lamb is the classic example. It forces David to condemn his own sin.
And finally, you often find songs embedded in narratives. Victory songs like the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15, or laments like David's beautiful dirge for Saul and Jonathan.
So when we interpret these, the goal is always to figure out what that little piece is contributing to the bigger story. Why did the author stop the narrative to insert a fable or a song right here? How does it affect our understanding?
Okay, let's move to the genre of law. We have to start by saying that Old Testament law is not a comprehensive legal code like we think of today. It often doesn't even specify penalties for breaking the statutes.
It's more like a select sample of cases and topics. It's articulating Israel's national policy for living in covenant with Yahweh.
Its main purpose was instructional, not just judicial. It was teaching the fundamental values of what it means to live in God's presence. It's not a technical reference book for judges.
For us, that covenant framework is everything. The law spells out the personal demands of Israel's sovereign Lord. It's interpreted relationally as a guide for their ongoing life with a gracious God.
And it comes in distinct forms. Casuistic law is conditional. It's stated as if, then. It often deals with civil or criminal cases and looks a lot like other legal codes from the ancient Near East.
An example would be Exodus 22.25. If you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not treat it like a business deal. Charge no interest. It sets a boundary for a specific situation.
The second form is unconditional law. These are absolute commands. You shall or you shall not. They're not dependent on the situation.
And these usually deal with moral and religious matters that go to the heart of the covenant relationship itself. Things like, you shall not murder, or honor your father and your mother.
These laws also tend to appear in a legal series, like the Ten Commandments. They're often phrased in a concise, almost poetic way that makes them easy to memorize. They represent the core principles that all the other laws flow from.
So, the big question, how does the law apply to Christians? We believe God intended the law to be a paradigm, a model of timeless ethical and theological principles. It's not outmoded.
We can think of it in a few categories. First, some laws are still literally valid because they're about universal morality or because the New Testament reaffirms them, like loving God and neighbor, or the rule about 2 or 3 witnesses.
Second, sometimes the New Testament actually makes the law's demand stricter. The 7th commandment forbids the act of adultery, but Jesus extends that to the intentions of the heart, to lustful thoughts.
Third, there are laws where the literal practice is now obsolete because of Christ's work, but they still teach timeless truths. The sacrificial system is a prime example. We don't do it, but it teaches us how seriously God takes sin and that he provides a substitute.
Same with the food laws. They're obsolete, but they symbolized Israel's special calling to be holy, a principle that now applies spiritually to all believers.
And fourth, when we apply the law, we generally apply it to the New Testament counterpart of the original audience. So laws for Israel as a nation apply analogously to the church. Instructions for priests apply to the priesthood of all believers.
Let's look at a sample law. Exodus 21.7:11. It's a casuistic law about a female slave taken as a secondary wife.
What's really striking about this law is how much protection it gives the woman. The husband is forbidden from selling her to a foreigner, and he can't deny her basic spousal rights: food, clothing, and marital relations.
And her right to freedom is based on the husband's breach of faith. The Hebrew word used there, bagad, implies a covenant violation. It means the law is treating her as a person with status, not just as property.
The theological point is crystal clear. God is committed to protecting the vulnerable from abuse. And the application for us today is to examine our own relationships and to look for ways to advocate for and protect the vulnerable people around us.
Now we'll turn to poetry, which is more of a literary style than a genre. It's the second most common style in the Bible, and it shows up everywhere.
We can start with prayers, which are spoken to God. The most common type in the Psalms is the protest, or individual lament. This is a petition for God to deliver someone from a crisis, like sickness or enemies.
And they follow a pretty classic structure. An invocation of God, a statement of confidence, a description of the problem, a specific petition for help, and then often a declaration of faith that God will act. Psalm 22 is a perfect example.
A few of these protest psalms also include an imprecation, which is a request for misfortune to fall on one's enemies, like in Psalm 109.
Then we have the 7 penitential psalms. These are where a contrite person is seeking God's mercy for sin and restoration of their relationship with him. They give us a language for our own repentance.
A dirge, or a funeral lamentation, is different. It's about an irreversible loss, like death. David's lament for Saul and Jonathan in 2 Samuel is a powerful example. It gives legitimacy to deep human grief.
Okay, the second type is songs, which were often sung in worship. The Thanksgiving song expresses joy for a past deliverance. The speaker addresses Yahweh, but also invites the community to join in the celebration, like in Psalm 30.
A hymn, or a song of praise, praises God just for who he is. It usually has a summons to praise, followed by the praise itself.
And we can distinguish between declarative praise, which cites specific things God has done, and descriptive praise, which lauds God for his general character qualities, like his majesty or holiness.
Liturgies are texts that involve 2 or more speakers responding to each other in worship. Psalm 118 is a good example, with parts for a leader, the congregation, and individuals.
And finally, wisdom songs. These are more meditative and instructional. They focus on ethical issues like contrasting the fates of the righteous and the wicked. Psalm 1 is the classic example of that.
Okay, let's move on to prophecy. When Israel went astray from the covenant, God sent prophets. Now, while they sometimes made predictions about the future or foretelling, their main job was forthtelling.
Which means announcing God's will for the present generation, often an imminent judgment.
Right. And the prophetic books preserve these messages, but they also arrange them rhetorically so they can speak to later generations facing similar situations.
Let's start with prophecy proper, which is direct speech from God delivered through a messenger. The most common form here is the prophecy of disaster.
The structure is usually pretty clear. First, it states the sin that justifies the judgment. Second, you get the messenger formula, thus says the Lord. And third, you get the prediction of disaster, often introduced by the Hebrew word laken, which means therefore.
Elijah's message to King Ahaziah in 2 Kings 1 is a simple, clear example. The sin is consulting a foreign god. The result is that he will die. The logic is inescapable.
On the other hand, a prophecy of salvation announces hope. It has a similar structure, just with positive content.
Then there's the woe speech, which opens with the exclamation woe or hoi in Hebrew. This form was probably borrowed from funeral laments.
Yes, by using the language of a funeral dirge, the prophet is expressing this deep outrage at sin and basically telling the audience that their judgment is so certain it's as if they're already dead. It's a powerful psychological tool.
The prophetic books also have prophecies against foreign nations. These often use the form of a war oracle, proclaiming that Yahweh will go out to battle and defeat the enemies who threaten his people.
Now, when we interpret prophetic foretelling, the messages for the prophet's own time, the first step is always to understand the historical context. What was going on politically? What was the religious and moral state of the nation? That's the framework for everything.
Second, you have to determine the nature of the judgment. Is it an invasion, an exile, a famine? That word, therefore, is often the key marker.
Third, and this is critical, pay close attention to the reasons given for the judgment. They're usually marked by words like for or because. And the reasons are always rooted in violations of the covenant, often the 10 Commandments, as we see in Hosea 4.
And for application, we should think by analogy. We apply these messages primarily to the modern covenant people, the Christian church, not to modern political nations. Our standard is the gospel ethos taught by Jesus.
And a very important caution. Divine judgment in these books didn't come because of a few isolated sins. It came after a long, long history of corporate sinfulness and a stubborn refusal to repent, often over centuries.
So the message of judgment is aimed at correcting a persistent, proud, sinful lifestyle that has taken root in the culture, not just a few individual mistakes.
That's right. Now, for prophetic foretelling, or predictions about the distant future, The prophets tended to see history in two ages, the present age and the age to come. They often viewed the future telescopically.
Meaning distant events could look like they were right next to each other, like looking at a mountain range from far away?
Precisely. And the New Testament helps us see that there were often huge time gaps between those peaks. So we have to interpret Old Testament prophecies about the future in light of Christ's first and second comings. The church age is sort of an invasion of the future into the present.
We also need to be aware of multiple fulfillments. A prophecy can have an initial fulfillment in the prophet's time and a later, fuller one.
A great example is 2 Samuel 7:1, God's promise to Solomon. It was fulfilled when Solomon became king, but the book of Hebrews applies it directly to Jesus, the ultimate son of David and son of God.
It's also key to remember that many prophecies are conditional. Their fulfillment depends on the people's response. Jeremiah 18 lays this out as a principle. If a nation repents, God will relent.
The story of Nineveh is the classic case. Jonah's message sounded absolute, but because the people repented, they were spared. The point of the prophecy was to bring about change.
Prophecies can be fulfilled in different ways. Some are historical and literal, like the specific timing of the end of a famine in Samaria.
Others have a historical and spiritual fulfillment. Amos 9 prophesied the restoration of David's monarchy, but in Acts 15, James interprets this as being fulfilled by Gentiles joining the spiritual rule of Christ. It's a broader fulfillment than anyone expected.
And some are just unexpected. The disciples were looking for a conquering Messiah, and they got a suffering one. The fulfillment was real, but it didn't look like what they had imagined.
Lastly, we have apocalyptic prophecy, the revelation of hidden divine plans. This is different from prophecy proper in a few ways.
First, while prophecy often calls for repentance to avoid disaster, apocalyptic literature tends to see destruction as inevitable. The call is for the faithful to endure.
Second, prophecy often sees God working through human means, like armies. Apocalyptic sees God intervening directly and supernaturally, with angels and cosmic battles.
And third, prophecy is direct speech from God. Apocalyptic uses mysterious, symbolic language, often delivered through complex visions that need interpretation.
So when we interpret apocalyptic, our goal should be to grasp the main ideas, not necessarily every single detail. Even Daniel struggled to understand his own visions.
So take the symbols seriously, but not literally. The four beasts in Daniel 7 represent four oppressive kingdoms. The symbolism tells you how God feels about those empires, that they are bestial and inhuman.
The main point of apocalyptic is always hope. It's written to encourage suffering believers to persevere. It stresses that God detests oppressive empires, that their time is limited, and that the saints will ultimately inherit the final kingdom.
Okay, our final genre group is wisdom literature. This is focused on practical living and ethical issues drawn from human experience and observation.
The most famous form is the proverb, a concise, memorable statement of truth. And they state a probable truth, a general principle for successful living. They aren't absolute promises.
We can break them down by type. Descriptive proverbs just state an observation about how the world usually works, like, some give freely yet grow all the richer.
Prescriptive proverbs are meant to influence behavior, usually by promising a benefit. Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord and will be repaid in full is an example of that.
And the most common type is the antithetical proverb, which draws a sharp contrast. Those who are hot-tempered stir up strife, but those who are slow to anger calm contention. The contrast shows you the wise path.
So when interpreting proverbs, you always have to balance one proverb with others and with the rest of Scripture. A proverb is generally true, but it might not apply in every single situation.
Right. All hard work brings a profit is generally true, but it doesn't account for a recession or a drought. You have to match the context carefully.
Another wisdom genre is instruction. This is in the imperative mood, giving absolute demands for obedience. Listen to my instruction and be wise.
And these instructions often include motive clauses that give you the reason why you should obey. Do not exploit the poor, for the Lord will take up their case.
Then there's the example story and reflection. This tells a short personal story to make a point, like the one in Proverbs 24 about passing by the field of a lazy person and seeing it overgrown with thorns. The moral is that a lazy life leads to ruin.
Let's analyze a sample text, Proverbs 30.2428, about the four wise creatures. This is structured as a parable using a numerical formula.
Right. The first three creatures model virtues that come from accepting their limitations. The ants are physically weak, but they model diligent, timely work by storing food. The badgers aren't powerful, but they model seeking proper shelter in the rocks.
And the locusts have no king, but they model self-disciplined community, marching in rank.
And the fourth creature, the lizard, is easily caught, but it gains this unexpected access to kings' palaces through quiet adaptation.
So the main theme is the wisdom of adaptation. It's about accepting your limitations and then living out these virtues of diligence, prudence, and community. The application for us is to think about our own limitations and how applying these virtues can bring order to our lives and please God.
So this whole deep dive really confirms that the Old Testament is an incredibly varied literary landscape. We've looked at narrative, law, poetry, prophecy, and wisdom. And having the right genre tools lets us get at the original purpose of these texts.
The big picture takeaway here is that God speaks through human writing, using human language and literary forms. So literary analysis is a way for us to tune in to God's intent, which leads to better understanding and application.
Whether it's narrative showing us how to live, or the law spelling out covenant stipulations, or a prophecy giving us warnings, the central message is always about living life in view of God's sovereignty and his revealed will.
We talked about how God's judgment against Israel came not just for a few sins, but after a long, long history of resistance to the law. So here's a final thought. What does that deep background of divine patience, shown across centuries and all these literary types, tell us about how we should view both the law as our ethical standard and the coming of Christ, with his grace and fulfillment? The law gives the standard, the history shows the patience required when we fail that standard, and Christ's coming gives the ultimate fulfillment and the ethos for the covenant community today. We'll leave you with that as you continue to study his word.